11 days after giving birth, I sat down at the dining table in my own home and felt as if I had accidentally walked into someone else's house. The pain in my abdomen still throbbed like a line of stitches that hadn't had time to close. My back ached from nights of broken sleep. My breasts were hard and heavy because my milk let down at all the wrong times, and my mind felt covered in a thin layer of fog, clear one moment and clouded the next. I still hadn't gotten used to holding the baby with one arm while reaching for tissues with the other. I still hadn't fully understood how, in less than 2 weeks, a woman could feel that strong and that breakable at the same time. This table had once been where Daniel and I ate dinner, where we argued over tiny things and made up before washing the dishes. And yet that morning, the tabletop was so clean it felt cold. There was no burp cloth I had absent-mindedly tossed over the chair. No low mechanical hum of the breast pump in the kitchen corner. Just a glass of water, Daniel set in front of me, slowly, carefully, as if he were preparing me to hear that someone had died. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me. The way he sat with his back straight, his hands lacing together, then coming apart, then lacing together again, told me immediately this was not a spontaneous conversation. Daniel wasn't looking at me like a husband about to confess something he regretted. He was looking at me like a man who had rehearsed what he needed to say, chosen the order of every point, even prepared for both my silence and my tears. That chilled me more than any confession could have. He started with a sentence so evasive it made me feel sick. "Things have gone too far, Emily. I need you to hear all of it before you decide what to think." I looked at him, my hand drifting instinctively to my stomach, still soft and sore, where my body still carried the marks of giving birth. I didn't know what exhausted me more, the physical pain that had stretched through the last 11 days, or the fact that he had chosen this exact moment to say those words. So I asked him directly, my voice dry as paper, "What exactly do you need to explain that had to wait until I was 11 days postpartum?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He swallowed, his eyes sliding past my shoulder toward the baby's bassinet in the living room, as if he needed something to anchor himself. That evasive glance was what made an old memory rise up inside me, sharp and violent as shattered glass. 22 hours of labor. I remembered every contraction surging from my back into my abdomen. Every moment I had to grip the edge of the bed, because the pain was so intense it felt as if my body were being torn in half. I remembered the white lights in the delivery room, the sound of the heart monitor, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with sweat and fear. I remembered Daniel being there too, but not fully. He held my hand, then let go. He bent down and told me I was doing great, then a few minutes later disappeared into the hallway for longer than he should have. His phone kept lighting up, always face down. Every time I asked what was going on, he answered shortly, "Just work. Don't worry." At the time, I believed him. Or more truthfully, I chose to believe him. When pain blurs your vision, you cling to anything that keeps you from collapsing. I clung to the image of Daniel as a worried husband, an anxious soon-to-be father, a man just a little clumsy in the face of a moment too big for him. Even when he stayed outside too long, I told myself maybe he was calling my mother, maybe he needed a minute to breathe, maybe he was panicking. My mother, Linda, had even squeezed my hand and whispered that I was lucky to have such a thoughtful husband. One of the nurses had smiled and told me it was rare for a man to stay that close through nearly the entire process. I had heard those words like a certificate, proof that I wasn't alone on the day I gave birth. Sitting here now, I could see that those same compliments were coming back to cut into me. It turned out Daniel hadn't been the only one deceiving me. Even the memory I had once held close and called happiness was betraying me now. I looked up at him. Daniel's face was no longer a face I knew how to read. It looked unfamiliar, closed off, tired in a way that had nothing to do with me. And I understood one thing with perfect clarity. The man sitting across from me that morning had not come to help carry my pain. He had come to lighten the weight of his own. "Then say it," I told him slowly. "Say what you've been hiding." Daniel clenched his hands, then finally looked me straight in the eye. His voice dropped low, as if anything louder would make everything shatter in front of us. "You need to understand I had no other choice then." That was the sentence that turned my whole body cold. Because I understood at once that whatever he was about to confess had not begun 11 days after I gave birth. It had not begun on this suffocating morning. It had already slipped into those 22 hours while I lay in that hospital bed, numb with pain, believing my husband was in the same room with me, when maybe even then, he had already been living in a different life. When Daniel sat across from me at the breakfast table that morning, there was a moment when I stopped seeing the man in front of me at all. All I could see was the labor room door opening and closing over and over again through those 22 hours I had tried to forget so I could live in peace. I remember every contraction coming in a cruel rhythm. At first, there was still space between them for me to breathe deeply, to grip the bed rail, to hear my mother saying, "Slow down, sweetheart." And then everything started crashing together, so fast that time could no longer be measured in minutes. It stretched into one dense, solid mass. Every time I opened my eyes, I looked for Daniel first. The way someone about to drown instinctively reaches for the one thing that might keep them afloat. I thought that if I could just see him standing there, I could survive one more contraction, and then one more after that. But even through the blur of pain, I remember that he never stayed still. Daniel went out more often than any worried husband normally would. He would come in, ask if I needed water, rest a hand on my shoulder for a few seconds, and then his phone would buzz, or sometimes it did not even have to buzz. He was already glancing down at it as if he were waiting. Then he would step back out into the hallway. When he came back, his face was tight in a way that felt wrong, not like someone who was fully in that room with me. At the time, I forced myself to think he was panicking. Men panic in delivery rooms, I told myself in his defense. Looking back now, I understand it was not panic because of me. It was the face of someone being pulled tight between two places, two stories, two responsibilities, and I was not the only thing occupying his mind. I sat across from him, my voice rough from lack of sleep and anger that had been compressed for too long. I asked him directly, "Why were you looking at your watch more than you were looking at me that day?" Daniel did not answer right away. His silence sent a cold line down my spine. I went on, each question feeling as though it was being carved out of my own memory. "Why, when the doctor handed you papers to sign, did you hold the pen and hesitate, as if you were standing in the middle of someone else's life? Why, when I was nearly passing out from the pain, were you out in the hallway again and again? Were you really in that delivery room with me, or was your mind trapped in some text thread somewhere else?" He clasped his hands together. It was only a small movement, but enough to tell me I was not wrong. Innocent people react faster than that. People with something to hide stay silent while they calculate what they can afford to lose. The details I had once brushed aside suddenly locked together with brutal clarity. Nurse Hannah had walked in just as Daniel finished a phone call in the hallway. I still remember how drained his face looked then, so pale that she stopped and asked if he needed to sit down. He gave a strained smile and said he was just a little tired. My mother, Linda, had also quietly mentioned that she saw him talking on the phone in a low but sharp voice near the vending machines. When she started walking toward him, he ended the call at once and said there had been some issue at work. We all believed him. Or rather, we chose to believe him, because no one wanted to think further than that on the day a child was about to be born. I stared at him. It wasn't work, was it? This time, Daniel looked up. There was no way back in his eyes anymore. He spoke very softly, so softly that if the kitchen had not been so quiet, I might not have caught all of it. No, it wasn't work. I felt my face go hot. Humiliation and anger surged through me at once, so hard that my throat tightened. During those 22 hours, I had thought I was at the center of my family, bringing our child into the world with my husband beside me, enduring the worst pain of my life in order to step into something sacred. And all along, even in that room, I had been sharing that place with another secret, whose name I did not even know. "I need to hear this clearly," I said, changing the way I addressed him for the first time without even thinking about it. "What could possibly have been important enough to intrude on the day your child was born?" Daniel swallowed. "Someone was putting pressure on me. It was personal. It involved me directly, and she said it couldn't wait." I laughed, but it sounded like something breaking. "She?" He closed his eyes for a second, as if not looking at me might make the confession less real. Then he said, slowly and heavily, that while I was in labor, another woman had been calling him nonstop. She was panicking. She said there was something that had to be dealt with immediately. She said it involved him directly. The whole kitchen seemed to lose its air. I could no longer hear the refrigerator humming, could no longer hear my baby breathing softly in the bassinet in the next room. All I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. I looked straight at Daniel, feeling as though if I blinked, I would collapse. I asked, "What is her name?" He answered with only one word, very quietly, but enough to shove the whole room into another life. After Daniel said in the delivery room that he had stepped out to take a quick call, I forced my memory to reach farther back, to the final weeks of my pregnancy. Like someone running her hand along an old wall, trying to find the very first crack. The more I remembered, the more clearly I saw that he had changed long before that. I had just chosen, at the time, to call it by gentler names than the truth. Daniel had become more tender, but it was the kind of tenderness that warmed me for a moment and left me cold for the rest of the evening. He asked if I had taken my vitamins, if my feet were still swollen, and if I wanted him to rub my back that night. On the surface, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like: a decent husband, a man about to become a father for the first time. But whenever I looked closely, I had the distinct feeling that he was performing each motion a good man was supposed to perform, not actually living inside that moment with me. I told him I was afraid the labor would be hard, and he took my hand. I talked about baby names, and he nodded. The second I finished speaking, his eyes drifted somewhere else, as if his mind had already returned to some room I was never allowed to enter. There were evenings when he sat on the floor assembling the crib. I still remember the dull knock of wood against wood, the way he bent over the instruction sheet, the look of concentration that used to make something in me soften. But he always kept his phone face down nearby. Every time it buzzed, his hand would pause before reaching for the next screw. He would glance at the screen first, then look back at the half-finished crib. Some nights, he got up and walked out to the back porch, saying the signal inside was weak. When he came back in, he picked up where he had left off as if nothing had interrupted him. And I told myself that a man about to become a father was bound to be anxious. Sitting here now, looking back, I can see there were so many signs, then, that I should not have been able to not understand. A strange receipt in the car from a cafe on the other side of town, somewhere he had no meetings. A few cash withdrawals he never clearly explained, only saying shortly that he needed it for something. A jacket carrying the faint scent of perfume that wasn't mine. Not anything I had ever worn. Not like my mother's or my sister's either. I remember picking up that jacket and standing in the laundry room for a long time, then forcing myself to swallow an easier explanation. Maybe someone at the office had brushed against him. Maybe I was just oversensitive because I was so close to giving birth. It was the same with the nights he said there was some urgent issue at work. Daniel came home very late. But he did not look exhausted the way a man looks after solving a problem. He looked worn down in the way someone looks when he has had to keep too many lies straight. I remember watching him open the refrigerator and drink water, his throat moving in quick, urgent swallows, as if he were trying to force down his own panic. If I stepped closer, he would turn, put an arm around my shoulders, ask whether the baby had been kicking a lot that day, and ask if I wanted to go buy a few more things for the nursery over the weekend. He always knew how to pull me back from the edge of suspicion at exactly the right moment. That was what hurt me most, even more than sitting there listening to his confession. If it had only been betrayal. maybe the pain would have had a simpler shape. But Daniel had not only hidden a relationship from me. He had guided my emotions step by step, nudging me toward calm whenever I was about to panic, soothing me whenever I was close to looking the truth in the face. He built a sense of safety that felt real enough for me to stay inside it willingly. Those final months of pregnancy, that I had once believed were the most fragile and tender season of my life, had actually been held up by premeditated words, perfectly timed gestures, and absences with ready-made explanations. I looked at Daniel that morning and asked him directly who the woman was. He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Ava." The way he said her name did not sound like a man confessing an affair. There was no intoxication in it, no longing, no courage either. It sounded more like the name of a consequence. Something he had been trying to postpone having to face. I waited for him to say it had just been a mistake, a relationship that had dragged on for a few months. Something ugly but still within the boundaries of what I had imagined. But Daniel did not go that way. He stared down at the table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and said slowly, word by word, "Ava didn't call to get me to come back." My chest tightened. The kitchen had gone so silent that I could hear the heater kick on and then shut off. Daniel looked up, his voice rough and thick. "She called because of the baby." My hands went cold instantly, because for the first time I understood that this betrayal might already have had a body, an age, and a heartbeat of its own. I thought I had already hit bottom when Daniel admitted the caller that day was Ava. I was wrong. Some truths don't come all at once to kill your faith. They come in layers. And each layer peeled back reveals something crueler underneath. Daniel sat across from me, his hands clenched together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. And then he said the sentence that sent a chill through my whole body, even though the tea in front of me was still steaming. "Ava gave birth not long before you did." I looked at him, not understanding for a second. My brain seemed to refuse to process it. I had given birth 11 days ago. My body still hurt, the tears still throbbed. My breasts were still tight and aching from the baby feeding through the night. I had not even had time to become myself again. And yet the man sitting across from me was talking about another woman who had also just had a baby, as if that were a fact that belonged on the table beside my life. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice roughening. "And for a while, I thought that baby might be mine." I heard the scrape of my chair against the floor as I jerked upright. "Say that again." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, as if the words hurt him terribly to say. But I no longer had enough humanity left in me to care about his pain. I wasn't sure. She said the timing didn't line up exactly, but it was possible. I was waiting for the results. I let out a laugh, short and sharp as broken glass. "So the whole time I was pregnant, were you being my husband? Or practicing being a father in two different places?" My question made his face tighten. He did not answer immediately. That silence was crueler than a full confession. If he had denied it at once, maybe I could have clung to some distortion of meaning, some warped misunderstanding. But Daniel just sat there, breathing heavily, eyes lowered to the table, like a man who knew he had nowhere left to retreat. I didn't give him time. When the doctor said I needed to get ready to push, where was your mind, Daniel? In the sound of me breathing until my throat felt torn open, or in Ava's apartment, waiting for news about that other baby. "Don't say it like that," he said very quietly. "Why not?" I cut in, my voice coming out so fast that even I could hear it shaking with rage. "Does the truth sound too ugly? Or is it because this is the first time you've had to hear it out loud?" Daniel lifted a hand and dragged it over his face. Everything was a mess. I didn't know how to handle it all at once. "Of course," I said, "because to you, this is a mess. To me, this is my marriage, the child I gave birth to. The 22 hours I spent believing my husband was beside me." He looked up at me, his eyes full of a pleading expression I had never found so revolting before. "Ava called that day because the baby wasn't okay. She had just gotten information from the doctor and needed me to confirm a few things. I didn't know what stage you were at then." I thought I would just step out for a few minutes and come back. I froze for a beat. In my mind, a possibility rose up that hurt even more than betrayal. Maybe Ava had no idea I was in labor. Maybe she was panicking too, with a baby who had suddenly developed a health problem. Maybe somewhere else, there was another woman being abandoned by Daniel in a different way. And if she did know I was in the delivery room and still had to call, then that proved only one thing: Daniel had dragged both of us into the same pit he had dug with his own hands. I looked at him for a long time. For the first time, I understood clearly that what had been suffocating me all morning was not just the affair itself. If it had only been one lapse, people could still call it weakness, cowardice, or betrayal. But this was not one lapse. This was a whole stretch of time in which he had lived between two parallel waits, waiting for me to give birth, and waiting for a result that could make him the father of another child. I was standing on the edge of agony to enter motherhood, while he was walking through the consequences of his own lies, still calm enough to hold my hand, still calm enough to say, "I'm here," while his mind had been split in two long before that. I asked, more slowly this time, each word heavy as if I had to drag it across my chest. "When did the result come?" Daniel said nothing. I saw his throat move. Then he spoke, almost soundlessly. "The day you gave birth." My whole body went still. The day I gave birth. Which meant that while I was holding our baby for the first time, while my mother was crying, while I looked at him and thought we had just walked through the biggest threshold of married life together, he already knew there was another truth sitting in his jacket pocket, in his phone, in his mind. And he still chose to come home with me. He still watched me struggle to stand after giving birth, still watched me change the baby's diaper with hands that were still trembling, still lay beside me for 11 nights, knowing full well that I was living inside a false belief. I heard my own voice grow quieter in a way that was frightening. "So for the last 11 days, you knew everything." Daniel did not deny it. He just sat there, and his silence was the fullest confession of all. I nodded slowly, as if my body needed to make some movement to stop itself from shattering on the spot. "Fine," I said. "Then go on. Tell me what the result was." Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped. I looked straight at him. And in that moment, I understood that whatever his answer was going to be, what had just broken in front of me would never, ever be put back together the way it was before. After the words, "Ava gave birth not long before you did," I thought I had already heard the cruelest part of the truth. But when I sat still long enough for the scattered pieces to find each other, I realized what killed something deepest in me was hidden in the last 11 days. The days I had lived beside Daniel under the same roof, with the sound of our baby crying in the middle of the night, with the smell of milk and pain medication, with the questions that had sounded like the gentle concern of a husband who had just become a father. I remember every night I sat propped against the headboard nursing our son, my back hurting so badly that even the slightest shift felt raw. There were moments when I started crying halfway through, and even I couldn't tell whether it was because of the stitches, the exhaustion, or the way my postpartum body was being dragged around by waves of hormones, too strong to fight. Daniel moved in and out of the room, then, with that familiar air of business, made me a mug of warm water, grabbed a cloth for the baby, bending down to ask if I still felt dizzy that day. One night, he even carried the baby up and down the hallway for nearly an hour so I could sleep for a little while. If I had told anyone those details before this conversation, they would have said I had a thoughtful husband. Now, when I remember them, I feel cold. Cold because I know that all through those days, inside his head, he was carrying a secret powerful enough to destroy this house. He stepped into the most sacred hours of my life, wearing a calm face so controlled it felt terrifying. He changed our baby's diaper with hands that were hiding a truth I should have been the first to know. He watched me struggle through postpartum pain, watched me kiss our son's forehead, watched me say that even though labor had lasted 22 hours, it was still worth it, and he chose silence anyway. By that point, the betrayal no longer burned like a slap. It was cold, like ice sliding down my spine, because I understood that he had been given so many chances to tell me, and every single time he chose the safest role for himself. I asked him directly, "Since when?" Daniel looked up very slowly. His face had that exhausted look of someone who had rehearsed a confession for too long and somehow believed that would make it less cruel. He said he had known almost from the day I gave birth. Ava had texted him after the paternity test results came back. He said it so quietly that if the room had been even a little louder, maybe I wouldn't have heard him clearly. But I heard every word. The results confirmed that Ava's baby was his. I didn't burst into tears right away. What stunned me wasn't the existence of another child. What lodged in my throat was the image of Daniel coming home that day, washing his hands, lifting our son into his arms, bending down to kiss my forehead, and asking if I wanted something to eat, while he had just been holding proof that this marriage had already been torn open from the inside. My postpartum happiness, that fragile bubble I had been trying to protect in the middle of pain and exhaustion, turned out to be a fake stage, and I was the only person standing under the lights who didn't know it. I still hadn't fully processed that when another detail from a few days earlier suddenly flared in my mind. Susan had called Daniel on the afternoon of the 6th day, after I gave birth. I remembered he had gone out to the backyard to take the call and stayed there for a while. When he came back in, his face was tighter than usual, but he still smiled when he saw me rocking the baby to sleep. I had asked if something was wrong, and he said his mother was just checking in on the baby. I had believed him then. Now I asked, "Your mother knew before I did?" Daniel was quiet for a few seconds, long enough for me to know the answer before he opened his mouth. "Susan didn't know everything," he said. "She only knew there was an old problem involving Ava, and she had told him to handle it quietly before I found out, or at least to wait until I was more stable after giving birth." That sentence made the pain spread in me in a different direction. Maybe Susan hadn't meant to stab me. Maybe she really thought she was sparing me a shock too early. But the truth was still the truth. There had been a circle of information around my own marriage, and I was the one standing furthest outside it. I laughed a dry sound so brittle I barely recognized it as mine. More stable for what, Daniel? So I'd be strong enough to hear that I was betrayed, or calm enough to help you save face. He immediately said he had done it to protect the family, so that my first days with the baby wouldn't be ruined. For the first time since the conversation began, his justification made me shake with more fury than the affair itself. I cut him off. I told him he had never protected me. He had protected his own stretch of fake peace. He had dragged it out day after day, so he could go on being the decent husband in everyone's eyes, so he could keep holding my son, sitting beside me, living in this house as if he still deserved any of it. I looked straight at him and realized the most humiliating part wasn't that I had been lied to. The most humiliating part was that I had allowed him into the most sacred first days of my motherhood, had let him step into the softest, most vulnerable part of me with hands full of deceit. Daniel swallowed hard. Then he said something that made me understand this conversation still hadn't reached bottom. "I didn't come here just to confess, Emily. I want us to talk about how to handle this so everything doesn't completely fall apart." I looked up at him. For a second, I thought I had heard him wrong. Completely fall apart. He was talking about this tragedy the way someone talks about a house with cracked walls that just needs the repair costs worked out. As if there were still some plan between us that could be neatly reorganized. I placed both hands on the edge of the table to keep myself sitting upright. "What is it you want me to fix for you now?" Daniel inhaled, then said the first thing he was asking for. The thing that made me understand his selfishness ran even deeper than the confession that had come before it. I had thought that after everything Daniel had just confessed, there couldn't possibly be another sentence out of his mouth that would disgust me more. I was wrong again. There is a kind of cruelty that isn't in admitting what you did, but in the way you arrange the fallout so that you end up safest. Daniel sat across from me, lowering his voice. softening it, as if speaking quietly enough could somehow make what he was about to suggest less filthy. He said I needed to stay calm. He said my body was still weak, my mind still fragile, that this was not the time to blow things up with either side of the family. He said it would be best to keep everything inside the house for now, at least until I had recovered from giving birth. He said it like a man thinking of my health, but I could hear very clearly what lived underneath those pretty words. He was not protecting me. He was protecting the order he still hoped to control. Then he went further. He said he would take responsibility for the other child. He said it very quickly, as if he could get the words out smoothly enough, the disgust inside them would not have time to fully form. He wanted to keep this marriage, still care for my baby, still preserve our family as it was, while also arranging his obligations to Ava and that baby in the most discreet way possible. I looked at him for so long that he was the one who finally had to look away first. In that moment, I understood the true structure of Daniel. He was not trying to ask for forgiveness. He was building a system that would let him keep everything that mattered to him: his wife, his child, his reputation, his outward decency, and even the right to step over the consequences on legs that remained almost untouched. I wasn't crying anymore. The anger inside me did not flare the way it had before. It settled into something so cold and sharp that I could hear every word as I said it. I told him, "You are not sorry you betrayed me. You're just panicking because the consequences are no longer in your control." Daniel looked up, stammering, trying to cut in. But I did not stop. I said, "You keep repeating words like stability, calm. We'll get through this together. It sounds kind. But what you're really doing is turning my pain into a crisis management job for me to do on your behalf. You want my cooperation to save your life, not to save me." His face changed. For the first time since the conversation began, I saw him truly pushed back. Maybe Daniel had assumed I would fall apart, that I would cry, that I would keep asking why like someone still trapped inside love. Maybe he believed in the old version of me, the woman who always swallowed one more hurt to keep the house peaceful, who was always reasonable so other people would not have to feel uncomfortable. I looked at him and realized he had been counting on that part of me to bargain with his betrayal. I even believed someone had advised him to wait until I was past my most vulnerable stage before telling me, so I would not have the strength to react too forcefully. And he had listened, not because he cared about me, but because that timing was most convenient for him. I told him the thing that sickened me most was not who he had slept with. The thing that sickened me most was that he had been able to lie beside me for the last 11 days, hear the baby cry, watch me change my pads, watch me take each slow step through pain, and still silently calculate the right moment to confess so it would do the least damage to him. Daniel started to say something, but I raised my hand and stopped him. I was no longer sitting there to let him lead the story. I opened my bag, took out my phone, and set it down on the table slowly. On the screen were the photos I had taken 3 days earlier from his smartwatch, half deleted messages, enough to piece together a truth he thought he had buried. Beneath them was a photo of a DNA test invoice in his name, dated before I had even given birth. I looked straight at Daniel and saw his pupil's contract, saw the hand he had resting on the table begin to tremble. I said, very clearly, "You're confessing the things you chose to tell me. I already know the things you tried to bury." And for the first time that entire night, Daniel truly went pale, because he no longer had any idea how far I had already gone before sitting down at that table. Daniel had barely finished asking to keep everything peaceful at home when I looked at him for so long that he was the one who had to look away first. That was the moment I understood something cold and unmistakably clear. He still thought he was talking to the woman I had been 12 days ago, the one who believed every delay of his had a reason. Every time he dodged was because of work pressure, and every strange behavior could be explained by exhaustion. He didn't know I no longer sat in that chair. I spoke slowly, my voice almost flat. "Do you think today is the first time I've heard the truth?" Daniel looked up. It was only the smallest flicker, but I saw the panic move across his face. He said nothing. I didn't give him the chance to rearrange his words. For several nights after giving birth, whenever the baby managed to sleep for a little while, I lay there awake in the dark. My body so exhausted it felt broken, and still I could not rest. The intuition of a woman who has just given birth, who is hurting, who is weak, can sometimes be the clearest thing in the room. I remembered the strange call that ended too quickly. I remembered the way he locked his screen when I walked in. I remembered the look in his eyes at the hospital, not the look of a worried man, but the look of someone splitting his mind in two and terrified one, and a half would shatter in front of him. I checked the phone bill because I needed something concrete to push back against the feeling that I was losing my mind. I traced the number. I sat in front of the screen for a long time, my hands shaking so badly I hit the wrong buttons more than once. In the end, I called anyway. The woman on the other end was Ava. I do not tell that part like it was some kind of victory. It was nothing like victory. It was humiliating, painful, painfully ordinary, the kind of thing only a woman driven into a corner would do. I expected her to hang up, curse at me, or pretend she knew nothing. But Ava was quiet for a few seconds and then asked, "You just had the baby, didn't you?" I looked straight at Daniel. Do you know what the worst part is? It isn't that she exists. It's that she knew I was pregnant. She knew my due date. She knew the day I went into the hospital, and I was the only person being kept in the dark. Daniel's face drained of color. He stammered, "Ava doesn't know the whole story." I cut him off. Exactly. Because you never told the truth clearly to anyone. You gave each person half of it, so you would always have a way out. I had turned that sentence over in my head all night. Now that I said it aloud, it felt sharper than every sob I had swallowed over the past 11 days. Ava is not some saint in this story. She made her own choice to get involved with a man who was not clear with her. She carries her share of the consequences too. But that is exactly why what she told me was even more brutal. Daniel had made those vague, suggestive promises enough to keep one woman waiting, enough to keep the other believing, enough to drag everything out without ever having to decide anything cleanly. The day I went into labor, he did not tell Ava his wife was giving birth. And with me, he did not say his mind was somewhere else. He moved through those 22 hours like a man standing between two doors, worried only about which one might close on him first. Daniel started speaking faster now, his voice more urgent. I was wrong. I know that, but I still love you. I still want to stay. I still want to do right by our child. I laughed, a short sound so cold even I could feel it. Don't use the word love to cover cowardice. And don't use the word responsibility to bargain with me. He froze. I kept going, one sentence at a time, never raising my voice, but making each word heavy enough that he could not slip around it. A mistake is something that happens once. You chose silence over many days, many chances, many faces. You let me give birth under the illusion that I was being accompanied through it. That is what I will not forgive. What do you want me to do? Daniel asked, and this time I heard the fear in his voice clearly. Not fear of losing me, but fear that, at last, he was going to have to pay for this in a way he could not control. I leaned back in my chair. The pain in my abdomen still throbbed, but in my mind I had never stood straighter. First, you leave the bedroom tonight. Second, Linda is coming to stay with the baby and me for a few days. Third, every financial matter involving the baby and me will be separated out clearly. Fourth, I have already contacted a lawyer. Daniel looked at me as if he had just realized the ownership of this room had changed at some point without him noticing. He opened his mouth to say more, probably another plea for a chance, for calm, for me not to make this bigger. I raised a hand and stopped him. You being this child's father is a responsibility. You betraying me as a husband is something else, and one does not cancel out the other. For the first time since the conversation began, Daniel could no longer steer it where he wanted. He just sat there, motionless, like a man finally being forced to look straight into a mirror, after months of living off the shadow of himself. I picked up the baby, felt that tiny breath fluttering against my chest, and looked at Daniel one last time. Tomorrow, nothing will be the way it was yesterday. I knew he thought it was only an angry sentence from a postpartum woman. He did not know I had prepared my first step before I ever sat down at that table tonight. And by tomorrow morning, I would begin at exactly the place that would leave him with no way back. After I said everything that needed to be said, I didn't argue with Daniel anymore. Some confrontations don't need to be won by volume. They only need to end with a decision clear enough to hold. I told him to pack a few essentials and leave the house that day. If he wanted to see the baby, it would have to happen in a way we agreed on beforehand. No more walking in and out, as if all the old boundaries were still intact. Daniel looked at me as though he were waiting for me to soften, waiting for the physical pain of postpartum recovery to make me yield one more time. But it was precisely because my body still hurt, precisely because I still had to move slowly when I carried my baby, that I understood I no longer had the strength to keep living in a house full of lies. That same afternoon, I called Linda. I didn't say much. I only said, "Mom, can you come stay with me for a few days? I can't be alone with this." She arrived before dinner, carrying a bag, some hot food, and that particular kind of quiet older people, how when they know exactly when to ask questions and when to simply be there. She held the baby for me when I had to stay in the bathroom longer than usual. She reminded me to take my medication on time. She sat in the armchair beside the bassinet while I slept in short, broken stretches. Her presence didn't erase what had happened, but it gave the house back a sense of safety I hadn't felt there in days. I separated out my spending money, gathered the important documents, photographed everything I needed to keep, and put it all into a bag near my bed. Those tasks were small, dry, and almost completely without emotion, but they were what kept me standing on solid ground. The next morning, while the baby slept, I called a family lawyer. I wasn't calling for revenge. I called to understand my rights, to know what principles would govern co-parenting if it came to a separation or divorce, so that later no one could use ambiguity against my child and me. For the first time in days, I felt that I was doing something not to endure, but to protect. I didn't lie to myself and pretend that once Daniel was gone, everything would suddenly feel light. There were still nights when I held my baby and tears fell into his hair before I even realized it. There were still moments when the pain low in my abdomen made me stop in the middle of the kitchen, reminding me that this body had just come through 22 hours of labor, and the 11 days after that inside a distorted version of the truth. There were still moments when I thought of the man who had held my hand in the hospital, and then had to remind myself that the man I missed was a version I had built out of my own faith. The pain didn't disappear. It just stopped wearing the mask of hope. I didn't go looking for Ava again either. I didn't need to turn her into the villain to give my story some order. She was part of the aftermath, but the one who built the structure of lies that placed two women in the path of hurt was Daniel. His job now was to take responsibility for our child, for the marriage he had fractured, for the consequences he had created on both sides. I was no longer taking on the role of reminding him how to be kind, how to be mature, or how to live honestly. From here on, that was the part of life he would have to carry himself. One morning, I carried my baby over to the window. He was sleeping deeply, his face still pink, his tiny hand loosely curled around my finger. I looked at him for a long time and understood something I had never fully understood before. Becoming a mother did not make me weaker. It forced me to stop negotiating with the things that hurt me. It taught me that love cannot be a place where one person lies and the other keeps calling it a family, just to make the pain easier to bear. Now, when I look back at those 22 hours of labor, I know the thing that chills me most is not only what Daniel did. It is the fact that all that time, I believed we were in the same room together, waiting for our child's first cry, stepping together into a new life. The truth is, I was there with my whole body, with my fear, my pain, my trust. And he walked into that room carrying another life, another secret, Another part of himself he had never truly laid down beside me. I am not choosing to stay in the emotional room, where I was the only one who believed it was a home. I am choosing a different room, smaller, quieter, with fewer people in it. In that room, there are bills to pay, sleepless nights, and very real exhaustion. But there is also truth and boundaries and dignity. And most importantly, there is my child and me. That is the last room I chose to stay in. Even though the truth came late, even though it came with pain, my child will still grow up in a place where lies do not take up all the space. And I, after everything I have lost, have finally managed to keep hold of myself.